Oh shit, can you hear me? Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, no, I should be thanking you actually. I'm a bit too proud of coming up with this little matchup of mine, so this was the one way to get it out. So thanks. All right. Just one quick warning. Okay, I am recording. Okay, so, um, all right. I got a presentation for you. So let me go pull that up. There we go. Okay. Alrighty. Just give me a moment. Okay. So, Morgoth Balglir versus Pelinal Whitestrake. Tolkien versus the Elder Scrolls. Um, the Dark Lord versus the Divine Crusader. Okay, really excited. So, cards on the table. I should probably tell you how I plan on making my arguments here. The way I'm going to be approaching this presentation is going to be proportionally focused on the characters that need the attention. Since Pelinal is a complete stranger, I will be focusing a lot more on him, since I know you guys are familiar with Melkor's story. Um, yeah. Well, he's in the new one that came out, so... Um, so on to the actual presentation. Um, what makes this such a great matchup, in my opinion? Well, to put it simply, their stories are very similar. Um, both are, or are directly associated with the satanic trickster deities from the creation myths. As gods, they were punished for their treason. But as warlords among the living, their crimes helped define the conflicts that would plague their worlds for eternity. They possess vague and abstract abilities tied to their past as eternal spirits, and they vanished long ago, but are destined to return. They were the strongest sorcerer kings in their franchise. In the case of Pelinal, only the gods seemed to surpass him. They both took their names from the slander of elves. As you know, Morgoth means black foe of the world in Sindarin, but Pelinal means Star-Made Knight, okay, in Aelia. Both were titles that were directly given to them by their elven victims. But perhaps what's more interesting are the things that separate them. Despite their similar histories, they both are directly opposed to one another in roles and mission. One is an agent of the gods, the other is at war with them. One is a coward, the other detests them. One elevates mankind, the other desires to supplant them. One conquered to destroy society, the other conquered to develop it. These two could not be more dissimilar. So, on to Morgoth. As you are probably familiar, he was the greatest of all the Ainur. He was extremely jealous of his father's influence and sought to bring discord to the first theme. He waged war against his brethren on creation with the sole purpose of sabotaging Eru's vision and replacing it with his own. He corrupted the earth and ordered his armies to murder and enslave the free peoples. The damage he ended up dealing to Middle-earth was deemed irreparable. His armies were, however, thousands of years later, eventually defeated by the host of the West. He cowered and begged for mercy before his crown was turned to chains and he was dragged out with them to the timeless void. But he will return during the apocalyptic myth in Tolkien's letters, Dagor Dagorath, where he will be slain following the destruction of Arda, his death preceding the second theme. So, Morgoth is an Ainur and gets all the general perks of it, which, if you just look at Sauron or Gandalf, that pretty much means he could do anything. He's shown molding mountains, valleys, and oceans several times. He was able to warp the living in Middle-earth into the original orcs and dragons, which he further bred. He was capable of sapping power from the two trees and the Silmarils. Obviously, being the biggest and the bulkiest of the Ainur, he would literally scale above everything else in Tolkien's works except for Eru Ilúvatar. But his most notable ability is his corruption. Morgoth was capable of divesting himself into the living and the earth, and was able to manipulate it into his own image. It's both an abstract explanation of his abilities to manipulate Arda, but it's also an actual ability that Morgoth seemed to uniquely possess, purely because he was the guy who, made up Discord. This ability did cost him. He starts the story so powerful that the forces of all other Ainur combined couldn't stop him. However, towards the end, he's, barely winning fights, against, elven kings, and he's losing abilities that are, pretty much just, by the norm for spirits like himself, healing himself or, altering his physical form. Now, onto the more important, person in this presentation. Pelinal was a reincarnation of the shattered god Lorkhan, who, if you're not familiar with Elder Scrolls creation myth, he was the god who tricked the 8 divines into divesting themselves into the creation of Mundus, and was eventually executed for it. Pelinal, however, was a mysterious, nameless demigod who supposedly immigrated to Tamriel to kill the Snow Elves as a member of Ysgramor's companions. The 8 ended up choosing him as their agent, a divine crusader, as you will, to establish kingdoms, gather armies, and build them to prosperity before abandoning them to start all over again, which he did throughout the Merethic era for well over 1,000 years. But he is remembered for his hyper-irrational and genocidal hatred for all elf-kind. Alright. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like this could easily dive down into, just like, oh, here's the definition of this word, here's the definition of this crazy term. Yeah, that's a problem, but that's what makes it interesting for me. Yeah, so he's probably mostly known, and remembered in history as being the chief soldier for the Alessian Slave Rebellion, which ended up founding the First Empire. However, consequence to this, he ended up exterminating most of the Ayleid kingdoms. These were elf-adjacent beings, as well as cowards within his own forces. Within a year, he and his army had surrounded the last of the Ayleids around White Gold Tower at the center of Cyrodiil, but Pelinal ended up profaning the names of the generals who ordered him to wait for reinforcements. He stormed the tower alone, destroying the 3 armies that occupied it, and slaying the demigod Umaril the Unfeathered before he was butchered by the last of the Ayleid forces while he was relishing in Umaril's kill. In death, he advised the First Empire incorporeally before losing himself to his dreams of his future and past incarnations, which he lives through to the present day. His crimes were used to justify retaliation for several thousand years, up until the present day in the Elder Scrolls universe. So, what can this guy do? Just like Melkor, he's a pretty buff guy. Pelinal is an Ada, which are the offspring of mortals and some of the original spirits, the Et Ada. Because of this, he has a lot more freedom to move around in Aetherius, which is the afterlife, than any other mortal, but not nearly as much as Morgoth being an Ainur, obviously. Being an incarnation of the Shattered God has a few perks, but most notably, it means that his soul, and therefore his personhood, makes him indistinguishable from the god Lorkhan. What exactly this could mean for him is very debatable. However, the direct implication is very clear. He ought have all the power and capabilities of his past life as the god of mankind, even if he doesn't remember it. Pelinal possesses memories and lived experiences from his future incarnations. In the Knights of the Nine DLC, he talks to the champion Cyrodiil, and he confuses him for whether or not he has already talked to other people in his death. He confuses it for the past or the future. He's not entirely sure. The Crusaders' relics, okay, is weapons and armor, which were built by the 8 divines. The Aliads were incapable of piercing it, and they possessed knowledge of war magic from before creation, being the most powerful sorcerer army in Tamriel's history. He was capable of preventing Aliad sorcerers from resurrecting themselves by casting plague spells. He has erased losses mankind has suffered from the timeline, even at the cost of continuity not making any sense afterwards to clairvoyants who peered into his past. He is documented and consistently shown to be fighting wars and leading kingdoms for roughly 1,000 years. Not nearly as long as Melkor, but still, his magic was of notable potency to the same Aliads that ended up naming him Whitestrake after it. To give a sort of scale on where he goes for the actual games, he scales vastly above other Elder Scrolls protagonists, obviously the Oblivion protagonist, but also the Last Dragonborn too, since he is, the ward to Moraeus, who he obviously would be superior to. So, on to Madness, okay. Little Doom Guy reference right here. Pelinal would often become so engulfed in his hyper-irrational rage that he would enter a state where he would erase the lands, the contents within, and the spaces between, and return them to the void. The 8 divines were absolutely disgusted by this. Saint Alessia, who was the leader of the rebellion, would be forced to make a sacrifice in order to coax the gods into soothing Pelinal, because otherwise it was believed that the entirety of Mundus would be consumed by him, and that the gods would abandon the earth in its entirety. Some contextual clues. He's not actually going insane, even though he very clearly is insane. What this is more in line with is like an emotional outburst, okay? He becomes so lost in his, anger and hatred, okay, for, people with very pointy ears. But in one instance, his madness would bring him down to elsewhere, and he would eventually fight Alkosh, who is the Khajiit personification of Akatosh, much like what Alduin was. He fought Pelinal in this state following his program, and ended up shouting Pelinal unconscious and sending him back to Cyrodiil, leaving a time wound atop Sunspire that still rests to this day. So, at a first glance, this is going to look like a stereotypical White Knight clashing against a Dark Lord. However, this isn't just a scene from a Monty Python skit, and I believe subverting those expectations that an ignorant audience might possess would end up exciting them. In truth, this matchup isn't going to be like Skyrim versus Dark Souls. It's probably going to be like every single other Doom Guy matchup you've heard. I don't think the appeal here lies exclusively with how powerful these characters are in their respective verses. Instead, their narrative and character parallels are enough to justify them being in an episode together. The verdict doesn't matter. Introducing people to these two characters and their esoteric stories should. These characters are basically blank slates. Morgoth doesn't really have any official designs. All I have shown you are just paintings, okay, some extremely passionate fans have done. And neither really have in-depth descriptions of their abilities, okay, what they look like, okay, how they are activated. These would be left up to you, how you would like to portray them, as fan works are all there are to representing both characters outside of their introduction decades ago. It should go without saying, you guys have a lot of influence over exposing to your fans new franchises they might not be familiar with. Either they have never heard of the franchise, or they have only ever been exposed to its most casual aspects. And obviously, Tolkien and the Elder Scrolls fit into that latter category. I think we can all agree that both of their worlds are perceived as far more simple and generic than they truly are. I believe exposing fans to some of the two most batshit insane tales will do casual fans enough to actually develop an interest in what set these worlds into place. People might want to learn where vampires came from, or what Balrogs are, or, who's this Ungoliant person, or why the fuck is the tavern in Riften named that? These are very important questions. Oh, hold on. Whoopsie. Sorry, you didn't see that. Finally, alternative pairings like Pelinal versus Doomguy, or Morgoth versus Sinestro, sort of are uncanny when you start to imagine these pairings actually meeting each other. Having two similar characters helps make interactions between the two feel more natural. Morgoth and Pelinal complement each other in the same way. I'm obviously not going to be dissing other matchups for obvious reasons, but having a biblical Satan figure like Melkor face off against a magenta-skinned alien wearing imaginary yellow spandex like Sinestro is going to feel a lot more uncanny than having him face off against Pelinal. I'm giving you an opportunity to have the two most recognizable fantasy franchises face off in their highest reasonable tiers. Okay, now that slide you didn't see. A fight between these two would sort of end up looking like this picture right here. Their confrontation in my head... Their confrontation in my head was always a subversion of Morgoth's canonical fight against Fingolfin, with Morgoth finding the Elf King slaying to Pelinal's sword after marching out from Angband. A fight like theirs would reform the shape of the world as that they stood in. Neither combatant ever facing a foe as strong as the other. I want their armor beaten off of each other, bone shattered as the two strike each other, feeling nothing but pure hatred for one another. I want Pelinal's helmet knocked clear off his fucking face, revealing his glowing and flowing white hair. I want Morgoth on his knees begging for mercy, whether or not it's a gambit, that's to be determined. I just want Pelinal to see the coward for what he is. I imagine a fight like theirs would start off in the earth, but would end up in the heavens, whether in the Timeless Halls or Aetherius, where Melkor and Lorkhan continue in their mortal puppets' places. Obviously, it's got to have a power metal OST. I don't know if you've listened to Blind Guardian's album on Morgoth, okay, or anything, but this is a album that is still fondly remembered to this very day, and it is very much strongly associated with his character now. And that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them. I'll just leave this slide here in case we don't touch on any of this, and thank you very much for your patience. Yeah. You don't have to read everything right there, okay? It's just, I just have too much in here. I'm like, well, maybe this is important. Maybe this is important. Yeah, he's in the Knights of the Nine DLC. He has like yeah, it's not a very good story. It's very goofy. The first line he has in the game, he sounds like he has a pirate accent. It's very weird. But I can understand why this white guy went way over everybody's heads, because this was like a book that was included in the DLC that, nobody reads the Skyrim books. So, yeah. Yar. Yeah, that's just him. That's just him imagining his future. Okay, as a guy sailing. Okay, the seas. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, and Morgoth's kind of in the same area, okay? People don't, people give credit to Sauron since he's the only one that's, people know about. But, then right behind him is, literally Satan, okay? So, um, yeah. All right. Yeah, it's a. I'm not usually um I'm not usually okay. Like I'm not usually into metal, okay, but just randomly one day while going through the r/battle music, okay, on Reddit, I just came across this one song about Morgoth's fight on Fingolfin, and I'm like, oh, that's fun. Oh wait, this is like actually like deep and insane. And then shortly afterwards, my brother exposed me to Pelinal, okay, so yeah, that's pretty much just how I, just immediately, yeah, it was fate. Yeah. Yep. Sure. Yeah. Thanks for being very patient. All right. You two have a good one.